I was in court when the judge gave my mom 2 years for attacking my grandma. That's when I lost the only family member I ever trusted. Dad squeezed my shoulder during the whole ride to his parents' house. It's just temporary. Until I can figure things out. Grandma was already on the porch, her camera hanging around her neck like always. Dad hugged me at the door. Be good for Grandma and Grandpa. His voice cracked. I'll visit every day. He left without looking back. The guest house smelled like paint and new locks. This will be your space, Grandma said, leading me through the converted garage. We want you to feel safe here. I noticed the windows had child locks. When did you? We've been preparing, Grandpa said from the doorway. Since your mother's first arrest, we knew this day would come. That night I couldn't sleep. Their voices drifted through the thin wall. We need to fabricate fresh bruises, Grandma said. Make it seem like the child is abusing us. Tomorrow night, Grandpa replied, after she's had time to settle in. My blood went cold. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The Wi-Fi was password protected. The landline just buzzed dead air. The next morning, Grandma brought breakfast on a tray. Click, another photo. You look tired, sweetheart. Your mother had trouble sleeping too, before her episodes. My mom's not crazy, I said. Grandma's face went hard. Your mother attacked 3 people. Violence runs in families. We're watching for signs. I waited until they left, then searched everywhere for a phone. The windows only opened 2 inches. The door only opened from outside. I was trapped. Looking for something? Grandpa stood in the doorway. I want to call my dad. The social worker comes tomorrow. He stepped inside, closing the door. She needs to see proof that you're dangerous. Just like your mother. What? Some scratches on my arms. Maybe a black eye. You just have to look like you did it. I backed against the wall. Grandma appeared at the window with her camera. Click. See? You're already threatening me, Grandpa said, backing me into a corner. I grabbed a lamp and smashed the window. The alarm screamed. She's destroying property, Grandma shouted, taking pictures. Just like her mother. I kicked out the glass and squeezed through. My ankle twisted, but I ran toward the neighbor's house. There's nowhere to go, Grandpa called, walking calmly behind me. I climbed their fence and dropped into the Hendersons' yard, pounded on their door with bloody hands. Help! Please! Mrs. Henderson opened the door. What happened? My grandparents are trying to frame me. There she is. Grandma appeared at the fence, crying. She had an episode. Broke our window. Mrs. Henderson was already looking at me differently. That careful look people give dangerous things. They're lying. But she was already guiding me back toward the fence. Grandpa lifted me over like I weighed nothing. Back in the guest house, Grandma photographed every cut. Click, click, click. Your father's the one who asked us to do this, she said. He needs evidence for the divorce. Proof that your mother's violence passed to you. The room spun. He wants her locked up forever, Grandpa added. And you in psychiatric care. Much cleaner than a custody battle. The front door opened. Dad's voice. How was she? There's been an incident. Dad appeared in the doorway. Saw the blood. His face went carefully blank. Did she hurt anyone? Only herself, so far. Dad nodded, still not looking at me. They left me with new locks on everything. Tomorrow the social worker would come. She'd see what they wanted her to see. Or so they thought. I hadn't told them about the old phone I'd found in the guest house closet. Dead battery, but I'd been charging it behind the dresser since I arrived. That night, it finally turned on. I called Mom's lawyer, told her everything. She recorded the whole conversation and called the police. The social worker arrived the next morning with 2 officers. Grandma and Grandpa had fresh scratches on their arms, perfectly placed. They'd done it to themselves overnight. She attacked us, Grandma said, crying on cue. Just like her mother. The social worker looked at me. Is that true? Check their bathroom trash, I said. You'll find the gauze they used to clean up. And check their kitchen. The knife they used is probably still in the sink. Grandpa's face went pale. The officers found everything. The gauze with their DNA. The knife with no trace of me. The camera full of staged photos with timestamps from before my attack. Mom's lawyer arrived an hour later with the recording of my call. Every word my grandparents had said about the plan. Every word about Dad's involvement. Dad was arrested that afternoon. Grandma and Grandpa that evening. Mom's case was reopened within the week. The attack that put her in prison? Grandma had provoked her for months, then called police the moment Mom pushed back. The camera around Grandma's neck had captured everything except the parts that made Mom look innocent. Those photos had been deleted. Mom was released 6 weeks later. I was waiting outside the prison when she walked out. She didn't say anything, just held me for a long time. We live in a different state now. Small apartment, nothing fancy. But the door's locked from the inside, and nobody's watching through windows with cameras. Dad sends letters sometimes. I don't open them. Grandma and Grandpa took a plea deal. 2 years, same as Mom got. The judge called it poetic. Mom laughed when she heard that. First time I'd seen her laugh in years. I woke up 3 times that first night to check the bedroom door. The handle turned smooth and easy each time, unlocking from my side like it was supposed to, but I still had to test it again an hour later. Mom was doing the same thing with the front door. I heard her footsteps in the hallway around 2 a.m., then the soft click of the deadbolt sliding open and closed. We didn't talk about it in the morning. She made eggs and I ate them standing at the counter because we only had 1 chair so far. The apartment felt empty but clean. No cameras watching from the corners. No windows that only opened 2 inches. I kept waiting for something bad to happen, for someone to knock on the door with new rules or accusations, but nobody came. On day 3, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Carol Thornton introduced herself as the victim advocate assigned to my case. Her voice was calm and professional, the kind that probably worked well with scared people. She asked how we were settling in, if we needed anything. Normal questions that felt strange because nobody had asked us normal questions in months. Then she said the prosecutor wanted me to testify at the sentencing hearings. My stomach dropped so fast I had to sit on the floor. I thought being in a different state meant I was done, that I'd given my statement and recorded everything and now other people would handle it. Carol explained that my testimony could make the difference between minimum and maximum sentences. That seeing me, hearing directly from me what they'd done, would matter to the judge. I told her I'd think about it. Mom came home from job hunting and found me still on the floor. I explained about Carol's call and watched her face go carefully blank, the same expression she'd worn in the courtroom when they sentenced her. She sat next to me and we stayed there until the light changed through the windows. She said it was completely my choice, that she'd support whatever I decided. But I could see her hands shaking when she poured tea neither of us ended up drinking. We sat on our secondhand couch that night, the one we'd gotten from a thrift store because it was cheap and didn't have any history attached to it. Mom kept saying I didn't have to do this, that I'd already been through enough. I watched her face while she talked and saw how scared she was. Not of them, but of me having to see them again. Of me sitting in a courtroom while they stared at me from the defense table. I thought about staying quiet and letting the lawyers handle everything. It would be easier, safer. But then I thought about Grandma's camera and the staged photos and Dad's blank face when he saw the blood. About how they'd planned to lock me up and call me crazy just like they'd done to Mom. Staying silent felt like letting them win somehow. Like saying what they did was okay because I was too afraid to speak up. I called Carol back the next morning. Mom held my hand while I dialed, her grip tight enough to hurt. My voice shook when I said I'd testify. But underneath the shaking, I heard something else. Something that sounded stronger than I expected. Carol said she'd set up therapy sessions to help me prepare. That there was a woman named Willow Curtis who specialized in helping people get ready for difficult testimony. I met Willow 2 days later at her office downtown. She was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that looked kind without being pitying. Her office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs, not the harsh fluorescent setup I'd imagined. She didn't make me feel broken or crazy when I told her about the nightmares, about waking up convinced I was back in the guest house with locks on everything. She just nodded and explained that my brain was trying to process trauma, that these reactions were normal and we'd work through them together. We met twice a week after that. Willow taught me breathing exercises for when the panic started. We practiced my testimony over and over until I could get through it without crying, though she said crying in court was okay too. She never pushed too hard or made me feel weak for struggling. Meanwhile, Mom started her new job at a property management office across town, filing papers and answering phones, work that was way below what she used to do before everything happened. She'd been an office manager at a medical practice before her arrest, handling schedules and insurance and staff coordination. Now she was doing basic administrative tasks for minimum wage. She came home exhausted every night, her feet hurting from standing at the copy machine, but she told me she was grateful. Grateful to have any job with a 2-year gap in her resume and a criminal record that wasn't expunged yet. Grateful that someone was willing to hire her at all. I started at my new school the same week. Elena Randolph, the counselor, called me to her office on my 3rd day. I'd missed the previous 2 days because I couldn't get out of bed, couldn't stop the panic that seized my chest every morning. Elena didn't lecture me or threaten me with truancy policies. She just explained that the school had flexible attendance options for students dealing with trauma, that I could do some work from home on bad days. That missing school didn't make me a failure. She made me feel less like I was drowning in normal life. Then Mom's lawyer called with news about Dad. The insurance company he'd worked for was investigating him for fraud. Apparently, he'd been taking out small life insurance policies on other people without their knowledge. Coworkers, distant relatives, people who wouldn't notice the premiums being paid in their names. Always small amounts that wouldn't trigger audits. Always people who might have accidents or health problems that could pay out. The lawyer said there was evidence he'd done this for years, long before the plan with me and Mom. That this wasn't just about custody or divorce. This was who he was. Someone who saw people as potential profit. My first full panic attack at the school happened during lunch. Someone took a group photo, and I was in the background. Didn't even know it was happening until I saw the camera. Suddenly, I was back in the guest house with Grandma's camera clicking, documenting fake evidence, staging my destruction. My chest seized up and I couldn't breathe. Couldn't get air past the tightness crushing my ribs. I ended up in the nurse's office hyperventilating while Elena sat with me. She didn't ask questions or demand explanations, just stayed present while I worked through Willow's breathing exercises, counting inhales and exhales until my lungs remembered how to work. Mom came to get me, and I saw the fear in her eyes, the worry that I was breaking under everything that had happened. But I wasn't breaking. I was just learning that healing wasn't linear, that some days would be harder than others, that surviving meant pushing through the panic even when it felt impossible. The envelope from Bethany arrived on a Tuesday. Mom opened it at the kitchen table while I poured cereal, and I watched her face go hard as she read. The papers were thick, official, with lawyer letterhead at the top. Grandma and Grandpa's lawyers were offering them a deal. Reduced charges if they testified against Dad, blamed everything on him, said he manipulated them into the whole plan. Mom read through both offers, her jaw getting tighter with each page. Then she stood up, walked to the counter, and tore both documents in half. The sound was sharp and final. She tore them again, until the pieces were too small to rip anymore. She swept the shreds into the trash with one hand and went back to her coffee like nothing happened. I stared at the garbage can. Mom looked at me over her cup and said they didn't get to blame everything on him when they were the ones who planned to destroy me first. Her voice was flat and certain. Dad might have started it, but they were the ones who locked me in that guest house and staged those photos and cut themselves to look like victims. They didn't get to save themselves by pretending they were just following orders. Willow mentioned her husband during our next session. Brian Curtis, she said, specialized in family therapy, worked with parents and kids trying to rebuild after trauma. She thought it might help if Mom and I did some sessions together, worked through things as a team instead of separately. I agreed because Willow had been right about everything so far, but my stomach twisted at the thought of sitting in a room with Mom talking about feelings. Our first joint session was the following Thursday. Brian had kind eyes like Willow, but a steadier voice, calmer somehow. He started by asking us each to describe one thing we wanted the other person to understand. Mom went first and immediately started crying, her words coming out broken and messy about how she failed to protect me, how she should have seen what Dad was planning, how she let me end up trapped in that guest house because she wasn't strong enough to fight back against Grandma's manipulation. I sat there not knowing what to say because telling her it wasn't her fault felt like lying. Part of me did blame her for not being more careful, for pushing back against Grandma hard enough to get arrested in the first place. But I also knew Grandma had been setting her up for months, deleting photos and staging situations, and nobody could have predicted how far they'd go. When Brian asked what I wanted Mom to understand, I said I just wanted her to stop apologizing and start being here with me now. The words came out harder than I meant them to, and Mom's face crumpled. Brian nodded like I'd said exactly the right thing. Bethany called 3 days later with the sentencing date. 6 weeks away, she said, which gave us time to prepare my testimony and coordinate with the prosecutor's office. She'd need me to do practice sessions over video calls, going through my statement until I could deliver it clearly without breaking down. Willow would help with coping strategies for the actual courtroom, ways to stay grounded when I had to look at them again. I hung up and stared at the calendar on our fridge. 6 weeks felt like forever and no time at all. I grabbed a marker and made a big X on today's date, then counted forward to the hearing and circled it in red. Every day between now and then got a small box in the corner where I could mark it off. Mom found me doing this and asked if I was okay. I told her I was counting down like it was a countdown to freedom instead of to facing them again, and she squeezed my shoulder without saying anything else. Mom's phone rang during dinner on Sunday. She answered and her whole body went stiff, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. I could hear a man's voice on the other end, professional and friendly. Mom listened for a long time, her face unreadable, then said she'd need to think about it and call back. She set the phone down carefully and stared at her plate. Her old employer wanted her back, she finally said. They'd been following the case, knew her conviction was getting overturned, and they had an opening for her old position. Better pay than what she was making now, better benefits, familiar work. But it would mean moving back to our old state, back to the place where everyone had believed the lies about her, where Grandma's neighbors and Mom's former co-workers all thought she was violent and unstable. We talked for hours that night, sitting on the couch long after our food got cold. Mom made a list of pros and cons on a piece of notebook paper, her handwriting neat and careful. The job would give us financial security, she said. Maybe enough to save for my college or pay off the legal bills faster. But I could see her hands shaking as she wrote, could hear the fear in her voice when she talked about running into people who still believed she'd attacked Grandma. I told her I didn't want to go back, that staying here where nobody knew our history felt safer, felt like we could actually build something new instead of trying to fix something broken. Mom looked at the list for a long time, then folded it in half and said, staying here was worth more than a better job. She called them back the next morning and thanked them but declined. Duncan Walsh left a voicemail on Tuesday. Mom played it on speaker while we ate breakfast. He was the detective who'd investigated the conspiracy, the one who'd found all the evidence about the staged photos and the deleted files. His voice was serious and measured as he explained he'd found something else while digging through old records. Grandma had done something similar to Dad's first wife years ago, before I was born. Dad's first marriage had ended badly, with his wife getting a restraining order against Grandma and Grandpa. The records were sealed because it involved their young children, but Duncan had managed to track down some of the court documents. Same pattern, same manipulation tactics, same camera and staged incidents. Dad's first wife had taken their kids and disappeared, changed her name, cut off all contact with that side of the family. Duncan wanted us to know in case it helped our case, showed this was Grandma's pattern of behavior, not just a one-time thing. Mom saved the voicemail and sent Bethany a message about it immediately. I sat there thinking about those other kids, Dad's children from his first marriage, wondering if they were out there somewhere living normal lives because their mom got them away in time. The nightmares started that week. I'd be back in the guest house, searching frantically for the phone I knew was there, tearing through the closet and checking behind the dresser. But it was never there, or the battery was dead, or it wouldn't turn on no matter how long I charged it. Grandpa's footsteps would get closer in the hallway, and I'd be trapped with no way out, no way to call for help, no way to prove what they were planning. I'd wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat, my heart racing so hard it hurt. The first time it happened was at 3 a.m. Mom appeared in my doorway seconds later, her hair messy from sleep, asking if I was okay. I couldn't answer, couldn't catch my breath, just shook my head and tried not to cry. She came in and sat on my floor without asking, pulled a blanket off my bed and wrapped it around herself and stayed there the rest of the night. I could hear her breathing in the darkness, steady and calm, and eventually I fell back asleep. Neither of us mentioned it in the morning, just made breakfast like normal and went about our day. Bethany's next call came during my lunch period at the school. I stepped into the hallway to take it, watching other kids through the window eating and laughing like their lives were simple. Dad's lawyer was trying to negotiate a deal, she said. He wanted to testify against his parents in exchange for a lighter sentence, claimed they'd manipulated him his whole life and he was just another victim. Bethany needed to know if we'd be okay with that arrangement before she responded to the offer. I told her I'd ask Mom and call her back. Mom's face went completely blank when I explained it that evening. She stared at the wall behind me for a full minute without moving, without blinking, her coffee cup forgotten in her hand. Then she said absolutely not, her voice cold and sharp. He didn't get to save himself by throwing them under the bus when he started this whole thing. When he was the one who asked them to frame me in the first place, when he nodded and walked away after seeing my blood on the guest house floor. He made his choices and he could live with the consequences. I called Bethany back and told her Mom's answer, and Bethany said she'd expected that response and would inform Dad's lawyer the deal was rejected. Carol Thornton came over on Saturday with a stack of paperwork. Victim compensation funds, she explained, spreading forms across our kitchen table. The state had money set aside for crime victims to cover things like therapy costs and medical bills. We qualified because of what happened, because of the injuries I got escaping through the window and the trauma we both experienced. But the application was overwhelming. Page after page of questions requiring detailed descriptions of every injury and every therapy session and every nightmare and panic attack. I had to write out exactly how I cut my hands and twisted my ankle breaking through that window, had to describe the scars that were still healing months later. Mom had to detail her wrongful imprisonment and how it affected her mentally and physically. Carol helped us work through each section, her voice patient and professional, but I felt sick reading the questions and worse writing the answers. Every word made me relive it, made the memories sharp and immediate again. The money would make a real difference, though, Carol said. It would cover Willow's sessions for the next year and pay off the emergency room bills that were still sitting on our counter marked past due. We finished the application after 3 hours, and Carol took it with her, promising to file it first thing Monday morning. Going back to the school felt wrong after everything. I sat in classes learning about algebra and history and chemistry, taking notes and doing homework like any of it mattered. A girl named Mia invited me to her birthday party during lunch on Wednesday. She seemed nice, had smiled at me a few times in English class, and her invitation was genuine and friendly. I said yes, because that's what normal teenagers do. They go to birthday parties and hang out with friends, and don't think about courtrooms and sentencing hearings. But standing in Mia's bathroom an hour into the party, I couldn't stop crying. Everyone out there was laughing and taking selfies and eating cake, and I couldn't remember how to be that person, how to care about normal things. When my brain was still stuck in that guest house counting down to a hearing where I'd have to face the people who tried to destroy me. I washed my face and left through the back door without saying goodbye, walked the 6 blocks home in the dark, and climbed into bed with my clothes still on. Mom and I started building routines to keep ourselves steady. Small things, predictable things, moments we could count on when everything else felt unstable. We made breakfast together every morning, Mom scrambling eggs while I made toast, neither of us talking much but both of us there. Sunday walks to the corner store became sacred, a 20-minute trip where we'd buy milk and bread and sometimes a magazine or candy bar we didn't need. Every night at 8, we watched one episode of a cooking show, some British competition where people made fancy desserts, and the judges were polite even when the food was terrible. These tiny anchors kept us grounded when the nightmares got bad, or the anxiety crept in, or the countdown to the hearing felt too heavy. Mom would remind me it was Sunday and we needed to walk to the store, or I'd remind her it was 8. And our show was starting, and we'd do these simple, normal things that proved we were building a real life here, one small routine at a time. Willow taught me this grounding technique in our next session that I started using everywhere. 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, 1 thing I could taste. I ran through the list on the bus to the school, in the bathroom between classes, lying in bed at 3 a.m. when the nightmares woke me up. 5 things: the crack in the ceiling, my backpack on the floor, the digital clock showing 3:17, the shadows from the streetlight, the doorknob that locked from the inside. 4 things: the blanket texture, the cool wall, my phone screen, the pillow under my head. 3 things: traffic outside, the refrigerator humming, my own breathing. 2 things: the laundry detergent smell on my sheets, the faint coffee scent from Mom's morning routine. 1 thing: the metallic taste in my mouth from grinding my teeth. The list became automatic, a ritual I performed dozens of times every day without thinking about it. At the school, I'd touch my desk, the textbook, my pencil, my sleeve. I'd count sounds in the hallway, smells from the cafeteria, the taste of whatever I'd eaten for lunch. Sometimes I'd go through the whole sequence 3 or 4 times in a row when the panic got really bad, when my brain started spiraling back to that guest house and those cameras and those locks. The technique didn't stop the panic attacks completely, but it gave me something to do with my hands and my mind, a way to pull myself back to the present moment instead of drowning in the past. The letter from Victim Services arrived on a Tuesday morning while Mom was getting ready for work. She opened it at the kitchen table and just stared at the paper for a long minute before she started crying. The victim compensation application had been approved, faster than Carol said it would be. Suddenly we had money for continued therapy sessions, enough to pay off the medical bills from my cuts and twisted ankle, enough to stop worrying about how we'd afford everything. Mom sat there with tears running down her face, holding the letter like it might disappear if she let go. I realized this was the first time since everything happened that we'd gotten good financial news, the first time money appeared instead of disappeared. She kept saying she couldn't believe it, that things like this didn't happen to people like us, that maybe our luck was actually changing. I made her tea while she called Carol to say thank you, and when she hung up, she pulled me into a hug and whispered that we were going to be okay now. The money wasn't huge, but it was enough to breathe, enough to stop choosing between therapy and groceries, enough to feel like maybe the system actually worked sometimes. Bethany's email came through on Friday with the final witness list attached as a PDF. I opened it on my phone during lunch and scrolled through the names, recognizing most of them from the investigation. Then I saw Mrs. Henderson listed as a defense witness for Grandma and Grandpa's sentencing hearing. My stomach dropped and I showed Mom the list when I got home. She read it carefully and explained what it meant, her voice going flat and angry. They were going to have Mrs. Henderson testify about that day I ran to her house, probably trying to paint me as aggressive or unstable or dangerous. She'd tell the judge how I looked wild and bloody, how I was yelling and pounding on her door, how Grandma appeared crying and saying I'd had an episode. The defense would use her testimony to suggest I actually was violent, that maybe Grandma and Grandpa had legitimate concerns about my behavior. Mom said it was a standard defense tactic, trying to muddy the waters by making the victim look unreliable or dangerous. It wouldn't work because we had all the evidence proving they framed me, but it would still be awful to sit there and listen to Mrs. Henderson describe me like I was the threat. Mom made dinner while I sat at the table staring at the witness list, and we didn't talk much that night because there wasn't anything to say that would make it better. Writing out my testimony took 3 weeks of back and forth with Bethany over video calls. Every word had to be carefully chosen, clear and factual without being too emotional. Bethany explained that if I sounded too angry or too scared, the defense would use it to suggest I was unstable. If I cried too much, they'd say I was performing. If I didn't cry at all, they'd say I was cold and unfeeling. So we crafted each sentence to be precise and calm, describing exactly what happened without interpretation or drama. I wrote about overhearing their plan that first night, about searching for a phone, about the window locks and the door that only opened from outside. I described Grandpa telling me they needed to make it look like I hurt him, Grandma photographing my cuts after I escaped. I included the part about them saying Dad asked them to do it, about his blank face when he saw the blood. Bethany had me practice reading it aloud over and over on our video calls until I could get through it without my voice shaking too badly. She recorded me so I could watch myself and see where I looked away or fidgeted or spoke too fast. We practiced for hours, refining the delivery, making sure every word landed clearly. Even with all that preparation, we both knew the real thing would be much harder, that sitting in a courtroom with them watching me would be completely different from practicing alone in my bedroom. Duncan called Mom's phone on a Wednesday afternoon and she put him on speaker so I could hear. He'd found something in Grandma's camera, the original unedited photos that had been marked as deleted but were still recoverable from the memory card. The photos showed Mom defending herself when Grandma called the police years ago, not attacking like Grandma claimed. The timestamps proved Grandma had deleted specific photos, the ones showing her provoking Mom and getting in her face, keeping only the images that made Mom look violent. Duncan explained how the forensic analysis worked, how they could see the full sequence of events now instead of just the edited version Grandma had presented to police. Mom went completely still while he talked, her hand gripping the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. These photos would be key evidence in getting Mom's conviction overturned, proof that she'd been framed from the beginning. After Duncan hung up, Mom sat on the couch staring at nothing for almost an hour. I made her tea that she didn't drink, and eventually she said she'd spent 2 years in prison for defending herself, 2 years away from me, because Grandma knew how to work a camera and delete evidence. Her voice was quiet, but I could hear years of rage underneath it, controlled and cold. The court hearing to overturn Mom's conviction happened via video call on a gray morning in late October. We sat together on the couch with my laptop balanced between us, the judge appearing on screen at exactly 10 a.m. He reviewed the new evidence, the recovered photos, the testimony from the investigation into Grandma and Grandpa's conspiracy. Then he formally vacated Mom's conviction and apologized for the miscarriage of justice, his voice grave and official. Mom just nodded silently, her hand gripping mine so hard it hurt. I could see her jaw clenched tight, see her holding back years of anger and grief that she couldn't let out in front of the judge. The hearing lasted less than 15 minutes, this quick legal procedure that erased 2 years of her life like they'd never happened. Except they had happened. She'd still spent those years locked up, still missed that time with me, still had that gap in her work history and that trauma in her head. When the judge logged off, Mom released my hand and stood up and walked to the bathroom. I heard the water running for a long time, and when she came out, her eyes were red but dry. She said she needed to go for a walk and left without her jacket even though it was cold outside. I watched from the window as she walked around the block 3 times before coming back inside. With her record cleared, Mom started applying for better jobs the next day. She sent out applications to property management companies, office administrator positions, anything that paid more than her current filing job. The responses came faster than expected, and within a week she had 3 interviews scheduled. She came home from each one looking hopeful and terrified at the same time, like she was afraid to believe things might actually get better. The first company called her back for a second interview. The second one offered her a position as assistant office manager with benefits and a salary that would let us move to a bigger apartment. She accepted and gave her 2 weeks' notice at the filing job, and that night we ordered Chinese food to celebrate. Mom kept checking her phone like the offer might disappear, like someone would call and say they'd made a mistake. But nobody called and the start date stayed firm, and slowly she started to believe it was real. Elena pulled me aside after homeroom on a Monday morning, asking if we could talk during my free period. We sat in her office with the door half open, and I told her a simplified version of what happened, leaving out the worst parts but giving her enough to understand. She listened without interrupting, her face calm and professional, and when I finished, she didn't act shocked or treat me differently. She just asked what I needed to manage my workload and anxiety, what accommodations would help me succeed in the school. We worked out a plan where I could take tests in her office if the classroom felt too overwhelming, where I could check in with her weekly to adjust my schedule if needed. She helped me organize my assignments by priority and showed me how to break big projects into smaller tasks that felt manageable. For the first time since starting at this school, I felt capable instead of broken, like my trauma was just something to work around instead of something that defined me. Elena said she'd email my teachers about the accommodations, and that I should come find her anytime I needed support. Walking out of her office, I felt lighter somehow, like having someone at the school who knew and didn't judge made everything more bearable. Bethany called 2 weeks before the sentencing hearing with news that made Mom laugh bitterly. Dad's lawyer was claiming Dad had been manipulated by his parents his whole life and wasn't fully responsible for his actions. Mom put the phone on speaker, and Bethany explained the new defense strategy, how they were trying to position Dad as another victim of his parents' control. Mom's laugh was sharp and cold. She said that was exactly the kind of excuse he would make, always blaming someone else for his choices, never taking responsibility for anything. I remembered Dad's blank face when he saw my blood, how he'd nodded when Grandpa said I'd hurt myself, how he'd walked away without looking back. Bethany said the strategy probably wouldn't work given the evidence showing Dad initiated the plan, but it might reduce his sentence slightly. Mom said she didn't care what excuse he used, that he was an adult who chose to destroy his own daughter, and he could live with those consequences. After Bethany hung up, Mom made dinner with angry, efficient movements, chopping vegetables harder than necessary, slamming cabinet doors. We ate in silence, and I didn't try to talk to her because sometimes the anger just needed space to exist. My breakthrough with Willow happened during our Thursday afternoon session 3 weeks before the hearing. We'd been talking about Dad for months in careful circles, never quite touching the core of it. Then Willow asked directly what I felt when I thought about him now, and something broke open in my chest. I admitted out loud that part of me still loved Dad and wished he'd been different, that I missed the version of him who used to take me to the park and help with my homework. Saying it felt like releasing pressure from a wound, this awful relief of finally speaking the truth I'd been hiding. I cried for the first time in weeks while Willow sat quietly and let me work through it. She said it was completely normal to grieve the parent I should have had, while also hating the one I actually got, that those feelings could exist together without canceling each other out. The love I felt was for the Dad I'd needed, not the one who'd tried to destroy me and Mom. I could mourn that loss while also being furious at his choices. Willow said healing wasn't about picking one emotion and sticking with it. It was about making room for all the messy, contradictory feelings at once. We sat there for a long time after, me wiping my face with tissues while she explained that this kind of grief was part of moving forward, that acknowledging it didn't make me weak or wrong. I went back to my therapy sessions with a lighter feeling in my chest, like I'd set down something heavy I didn't know I was carrying. Willow noticed right away and asked what changed. I told her about admitting I still loved the Dad I needed, not the one I got, and she smiled like I'd solved a puzzle she'd been waiting for me to figure out. We talked about how healing meant accepting all the messy feelings at once instead of picking one and pretending the others didn't exist. She said the grief would probably come back sometimes, especially during big moments like the hearings, but now I had tools to handle it instead of letting it bury me. The next week, Mom came home from work with this careful excitement on her face that made me look up from my homework. She sat down at our tiny kitchen table and told me a small accounting firm offered her an office manager position with real pay and benefits. Her hands were shaking when she showed me the offer letter, and I could see she was afraid to believe it was real after everything that happened. I hugged her and said she should take it, that we deserved something good finally. She called them back that same night and accepted, her voice steady and professional in a way I hadn't heard in years. We ordered pizza to celebrate, our first real celebration since everything fell apart, and sat on our couch eating straight from the box while watching a cooking show we both liked. It felt fragile, like we were both waiting for something to go wrong, but also genuine in a way that made my throat tight. Mom kept smiling at random moments, and I realized how long it had been since I'd seen her look anything close to happy. The week before we had to fly back for the sentencing hearings, my stomach started twisting itself into knots that wouldn't loosen. I couldn't eat more than a few bites at meals, and sleep became impossible past 3 or 4 in the morning. Mom noticed and took time off from her new job to stay home with me, which made me feel guilty but also relieved. We spent those days watching movies on our laptop, wrapped in blankets on the couch, not talking about what was coming because talking about it made it too real. She'd pause the movie every so often to ask if I needed anything, and I'd shake my head even though what I needed was for the hearings to be over and done. We existed in this weird bubble where time moved too fast and too slow at once, each day bringing us closer to something I wanted finished but dreaded facing. Mom made simple meals I could actually stomach and sat with me while I picked at them, not pushing me to eat more but making sure I had something. At night, she'd check on me every few hours when I couldn't sleep, and sometimes she'd just sit on my floor until I dozed off again. It helped more than I could explain, having her there steady and present when everything inside me felt like it was shaking apart. Bethany called 3 days before we left to confirm the hotel arrangements near the courthouse. She'd set us up in a place with security because she didn't want us anywhere near Dad's family or anyone who might recognize us and cause problems. The hotel was under a different name, and the staff knew not to give out our room number to anyone who asked. Carol met us at the airport when we landed, her calm presence immediately making things feel more manageable. She drove us to the hotel while talking through logistics in that steady way she had, explaining the timeline for each hearing and where we'd need to be when. I stared out the window at streets that used to be familiar, watching my old neighborhood pass by like scenes from someone else's life. Everything looked smaller and stranger than I remembered, like the whole city had shrunk while I was gone. The buildings and intersections triggered memories I'd been trying not to think about, and I had to focus on my breathing exercises to keep from spiraling. Carol noticed and switched to talking about completely normal things like the weather and traffic patterns, giving me something safe to focus on until we pulled into the hotel parking garage. Our room had 2 beds and thick curtains that blocked out all the light, and Mom immediately checked every lock twice before sitting down. That night, Mom and I did a joint session with Brian over video call, both of us sitting on one bed with the laptop between us. He walked us through what to expect emotionally during the hearings, his voice calm and matter-of-fact in a way that made it feel less scary. He reminded us that we'd already survived the worst parts, that this was just about making sure they faced consequences for what they did. His certainty helped more than I expected, like having someone tell me I was strong enough to handle something I wasn't sure I could handle. He taught us some grounding techniques to use if we started panicking in the courtroom, simple things like pressing our feet flat on the floor and counting our breaths. Mom asked questions about how to support me without hovering, and Brian gave her specific things to watch for and ways to help. By the end of the call, I felt less like I was walking into a nightmare, and more like I was walking into something difficult but survivable. We ordered room service after and ate in silence, both too tired and wrung out to talk, but it was a comfortable silence that felt like we were in this together. The morning of Grandma and Grandpa's sentencing hearing arrived too fast and too slow at once. I put on the clothes Bethany had helped me pick out, simple and neat without looking like I was trying too hard. Mom braided my hair the way she used to when I was little, her fingers gentle and familiar, and neither of us mentioned how my hands were shaking. Carol picked us up early and walked us through security at the courthouse, staying close while reporters shouted questions we'd been told to ignore. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and overexposed. I sat between Carol and Mom in the front row, both of them close enough that I could feel their presence like anchors. Grandma and Grandpa were let in wearing orange jumpsuits, and they looked so much smaller than I remembered, older and defeated in a way that should have felt satisfying, but just felt empty. Grandpa stared straight ahead like he was somewhere else entirely, and Grandma kept her eyes down, refusing to look at me even when I walked past them to the witness stand. My legs felt wobbly, but I made it to the chair without stumbling, and the bailiff asked me to state my name for the record. I read my testimony clearly and steadily, describing exactly what they did and how it felt to be trapped in that guest house knowing they were planning to destroy me. The words came out easier than I expected, like I'd practiced them so many times they'd become separate from the actual memories. I explained how I overheard their plan that first night, how they staged the scratches on their arms, how Grandma took pictures of everything to build false evidence. The judge listened intently, leaning forward slightly, and when I described hearing them discuss fabricating bruises while I lay awake terrified, his expression hardened with something that looked like disgust. I talked about smashing the window and running to the Hendersons, about how Grandma cried on cue and made me look dangerous. My voice only shook once when I explained how they told me Dad was part of the plan, but I pushed through it and finished strong. Bethany asked a few follow-up questions that let me clarify the timeline, and then the defense lawyer stood up for cross-examination. He tried to make me seem confused about dates and times, but I had everything written down and stayed calm while correcting him. When I stepped down, Carol squeezed my hand and Mom's eyes were red, but she was smiling. Mrs. Henderson testified for the defense like we knew she would, describing how I looked wild and aggressive when I pounded on her door that day. She said I seemed dangerous, that my hands were bloody, and I was screaming about my grandparents in a way that frightened her. The defense lawyer asked her to describe my demeanor, and she used words like unstable and violent, painting me as the threat. But on cross-examination, Bethany got her to admit she only saw me for about 2 minutes total, before Grandma appeared. Bethany asked if Grandma and Grandpa had been telling her stories about my supposed violent tendencies before that day, and Mrs. Henderson hesitated before admitting they had, for weeks. She said they'd warned her I was dangerous like my mother, that I had episodes where I couldn't control myself. Mrs. Bethany asked if Mrs. Henderson had any personal experience with me being violent before that day, and she had to say no. By the end of the cross-examination, it was clear Mrs. Henderson had been primed to see me as a threat before I ever showed up at her door, and the judge looked thoughtful in a way that seemed good for us. The judge took a brief recess before sentencing, and we waited in a small room where Carol brought us water we didn't drink. When we went back in, the judge spent several minutes reviewing the evidence and describing what Grandma and Grandpa had done. He called their actions a calculated campaign of psychological abuse against a child, and said the premeditation and planning made it especially serious. He sentenced Grandma to 4 years in prison, then Grandpa to 4 years as well, both sentences longer than Mom's original sentence. Grandma started crying, these loud sobs that filled the courtroom, and Grandpa just stared straight ahead like he still wasn't really present. The judge said they'd abused their position as grandparents and caregivers to try to destroy their own granddaughter, and that kind of betrayal deserved serious consequences. I felt something hard and tight in my chest finally start to loosen, like a fist unclenching after holding on too long. Mom's hand found mine and squeezed, and Carol leaned over to whisper that it was over. They were going to prison. We left through a side exit to avoid reporters, and back at the hotel I slept for 12 hours straight. Dad's sentencing hearing happened 2 days later, and this one felt harder from the moment I woke up. Mom made me eat breakfast even though my stomach was in knots, and Carol picked us up early again for the drive to the courthouse. Walking into the courtroom this time felt different, heavier, because this was the person who was supposed to protect me. Dad was already sitting at the defense table when we arrived, and when I walked in, he looked at me with this expression like he was the victim in all this. His eyes were red and his face looked thinner, and he had this wounded look that made me want to scream. I had to look away and focus on Bethany's steady presence at the prosecutor's table, reminding myself that his hurt feelings didn't matter compared to what he'd done. Carol sat on my right and Mom on my left again, both of them close enough to ground me. The judge came in and we all stood, and then I was called to the witness stand for the second time in 3 days. I testified again, this time about the moment I realized Dad was part of the plan, how his face went blank when he saw the blood on my hands and arms. My voice shook more this time because this betrayal cut deeper than anything his parents did. I described how he nodded when Grandpa said I'd only hurt myself, how he asked if I'd hurt anyone else like he was hoping for evidence against me. I explained the conversation I'd overheard where Grandma said he'd asked them to do this, that he wanted Mom locked up forever and me in psychiatric care. The words came harder than they had at the first hearing, catching in my throat and making me pause to breathe. I talked about how he'd squeezed my shoulder in the car and promised to visit every day, how he'd hugged me at his parents' door and told me to be good. The judge watched me carefully, and I could see him understanding how much worse it was when the person planning your destruction was your own father. Bethany asked me how it felt to discover Dad's involvement, and I had to stop and collect myself before answering that it felt like losing the only parent I thought I had left. Dad's lawyer stood up and called him to the witness stand the next morning. Dad walked slowly to the front, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying something heavy. The bailiff made him swear to tell the truth, and he sat down in the chair, gripping the armrests with white knuckles. His lawyer started with easy questions about his childhood, about growing up with Grandma and Grandpa, about how they raised him. Dad's voice cracked when he talked about them, making it sound like they were victims too. Then his lawyer asked about me, and Mom and Dad started crying. Real tears running down his face as he claimed he was just trying to protect me from Mom's violence. He said his parents convinced him that Mom was dangerous, that I was in danger, that they needed to document everything to keep me safe. He made it sound like he was the one being manipulated, like he was just a worried father who got bad advice. His lawyer asked if he understood what his parents were really planning, and Dad shook his head, wiping his eyes. He said he thought they were helping him build a custody case, not trying to frame anyone. The crying got worse when he talked about the moment he realized what they'd done, how horrified he was, how he wanted to stop it but didn't know how. It was a good performance, and I could see some people in the courtroom buying it. But then Bethany stood up for cross-examination, and everything changed. She pulled out printed emails and asked Dad if he recognized them. His face went pale and he nodded slowly. She read the first one out loud, dated 3 months before Mom's arrest, where Dad wrote to Grandpa about needing evidence that Mom was unstable. She read another one where Dad suggested they could use me as proof that violence ran in the family. Email after email, all showing Dad planning every step, coordinating timing with his parents, discussing how to make it look believable. Bethany asked him directly if these were his words, and he couldn't deny it because his email address was right there at the top. She asked if someone who was manipulated would send emails like this, organizing the whole thing, and Dad just sat there with his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find words. She showed the timeline proving Dad contacted his parents first, that he initiated the plan, that he gave them specific instructions about what kind of evidence they needed. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge let Bethany continue. She asked Dad why he claimed his parents manipulated him when the emails showed he was the one giving orders. She asked why he pretended to be horrified when he saw my blood if he'd known exactly what was supposed to happen that day. Dad's crying stopped and his face went blank again, that same careful, empty look he had when he first saw me bleeding. Bethany asked one final question about whether he felt any remorse for what he put his daughter through, and Dad looked at me for the first time since taking the stand. I stared back and didn't look away. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out, and after a long silence, he just said, "No." He didn't feel remorse because he thought it was necessary. The courtroom went completely quiet, and I saw the judge's expression harden into something cold. The judge called a short recess and then came back to deliver the sentence. He looked at Dad sitting at the defense table and started talking about how the court had reviewed all the evidence carefully. He said the emails proved beyond any doubt that Dad was the architect of the conspiracy, the one who planned and coordinated everything. He talked about how Dad had betrayed both his wife and daughter for financial gain, how he'd used his own parents as tools in a scheme to destroy his family. The judge's voice got harder when he described the psychological damage Dad caused, how he'd deliberately tried to get me locked up in psychiatric care. He said the manipulation of elderly parents to commit crimes on his behalf showed a particular kind of cruelty. Then he sentenced Dad to 5 years in prison, calling him the architect of a conspiracy to frame both his wife and daughter for his own financial and custody gain. Dad's face crumpled like paper, and he made this choking sound. He turned in his chair trying to look at me, but the bailiff was already standing up, already reaching for his arm. Dad tried to say my name, but the bailiff pulled him to his feet and started walking him toward the side door. I watched him go and felt nothing, just this empty space where feelings about him used to be. The door closed behind him and he was gone. Bethany came over to where Mom and I sat with Carol. She gathered her papers and told us there would be an option for a civil lawsuit where we could sue all 3 of them for damages. She explained we could potentially get money for therapy costs, emotional distress, Mom's lost wages from being wrongly imprisoned. Mom listened and nodded, but her face looked tired. She told Bethany she'd think about it, but right now she just wanted to go home to our apartment and never think about any of them again. Bethany understood and gave us her card in case we changed our minds. Carol drove us back to the hotel, and we packed our few things in silence. The flight home the next day felt endless, both of us exhausted and emotionally wrung out, but also lighter somehow, like we'd been carrying something heavy and finally put it down. Carol had come to the airport to see us off, and she gave me her card before we went through security. She said to call anytime, that she was always available if I needed to talk. I took the card and realized I actually might call her because she'd been steady and helpful through all of this, without making me feel weak or broken. Mom squeezed my hand as we walked to our gate, and we didn't talk much on the plane, just sat together watching clouds through the window. Back in our apartment, 3 days passed in a blur of sleeping late and watching TV. We ordered takeout and didn't talk about the hearings, didn't talk about Dad or his parents, just existed together in our safe space. Mom made tea, and I curled up on the couch and we watched cooking shows without really paying attention. On the 4th day, Mom's alarm went off early and she got dressed for work. I got ready for school and we ate breakfast together like normal people with normal routines. It felt strange and good at the same time, this return to regular life after everything. Mom kissed my forehead before leaving and told me to have a good day, and I realized we were actually going to be okay. Elena pulled me aside after second period when I got back to the school. She looked at me carefully and said I seemed different, calmer somehow. I told her the hearings were over and everyone got sentenced. She smiled and said, I looked like I was carrying less weight, and I realized she was right. Something had shifted when I watched them get led away in handcuffs, like a door closing on that part of my life. Elena asked if I wanted to talk about it, and I said maybe later, but right now I just wanted to focus on catching up on homework. She gave me a schedule for making up the work I'd missed and told me to come by her office anytime. Walking to my next class felt easier, my backpack lighter even though it had the same books in it. My session with Willow that week focused on processing the hearings. I sat in her office and tried to explain how I felt, but the words came out confused. She asked if I felt triumphant or satisfied, and I shook my head. I just felt tired and ready to move forward, like I'd finished something difficult but not in a celebrating way. Willow nodded and said that was normal, that closure doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it just feels like the end of something painful, like closing a book you're glad to be done reading. She asked about my nightmares, and I told her they were less frequent now, that I'd slept through the night twice since coming home. We talked about what moving forward meant, and I realized I didn't have a clear answer yet. Just knew I wanted to build something new instead of staying stuck in what happened. Mom told me over dinner a few days later that she decided not to pursue the civil lawsuit. She explained that she didn't want to spend more years tied to them through legal proceedings, didn't want to keep reliving everything in depositions and court dates. I understood completely and told her so. We had enough money to get by now with her job and the victim compensation funds, and our peace was worth more than whatever we might win in court. Mom looked relieved that I agreed, and we finished eating while talking about her work instead, about the funny thing her boss said that day, about normal stuff that had nothing to do with the past. At the school, I started talking to people more instead of keeping to myself. A girl named Mia, who sat near me in history class, invited me to study group, and I said yes before I could overthink it. We met at the library after school and worked on our homework together, and it felt good to focus on normal things like algebra problems and history test dates. Mia was funny and smart, and she didn't ask about my life or where I came from, just treated me like a regular person. I laughed at her jokes about our history teacher and helped her figure out a math problem, and walking home afterward, I realized I'd gone 2 hours without thinking about anything bad. It felt like progress. Mom and I had a family session with Brian where we talked about Dad's letters. They kept coming every few weeks even though we never opened them, just piled up on the kitchen counter, making us both tense. Brian asked what we wanted to do with them, and Mom said she didn't know, that opening them felt like letting Dad back in, but throwing them away felt wrong too. Brian suggested we create a ritual for dealing with them, something that gave us control. We talked through different options and decided to collect them unopened in a box that we'd keep in the hall closet. We could deal with them when and if we were ever ready, but they wouldn't be sitting out where we had to see them every day. Brian said that was a healthy boundary, and Mom looked relieved to have a plan. We bought a plain cardboard box that weekend and put all the letters inside, then put the box on the top shelf where we couldn't see it. It felt better having them contained and out of sight, like we'd taken back some power over how they affected us. Duncan called 3 weeks after the sentencing hearings with his final update. He explained that the insurance fraud investigators had traced Dad's policies back over 15 years, finding 12 different people he'd taken out small coverage on without their knowledge. Some were coworkers, some were distant relatives, and 2 were neighbors who'd had accidents or serious health problems. The insurance company was filing separate criminal charges because fraud fell outside the conspiracy case. Duncan said Dad's sentence could get extended by another 3 to 5 years depending on how many charges stuck. Mom listened to me relay this information and just nodded, saying she didn't care how long he stayed locked up as long as he stayed away from us. I thanked Duncan for everything and hung up, feeling like this was truly the last piece of that old life finally closing. I woke up one Tuesday morning and realized I'd slept through the entire night without a single nightmare. I lay there testing my memory of the night, searching for the usual fragments of locked doors or camera flashes, but found nothing except solid sleep. I didn't mention it to Mom at breakfast because saying it out loud felt like tempting fate, like acknowledging it would make the nightmares return. When it happened again the next night, I started to believe it might be real progress. The third night I slept through completely. I told Willow about it during our session. She smiled this huge, genuine smile and said this was a major victory, that my brain was finally starting to feel safe enough to rest. I felt proud of myself for the first time in months, proud that my body was healing even when I wasn't actively trying to fix it. Mom came home from work 4 months after starting her job with news that made her practically bounce through the door. Her boss had promoted her to senior office manager with a significant raise, enough that we could afford to move to a better apartment in a nicer neighborhood. We spent that whole evening looking at rental listings online, pointing at pictures of places with actual living rooms that could fit real couches and kitchens with dishwashers. Mom kept saying we didn't need anything fancy, but I could see her eyes light up when she found a 2-bedroom place with big windows and a small balcony. We scheduled viewings for the weekend and made a list of furniture we'd need to buy, planning out this new space like we were planning out a new version of our lives. Bethany's email arrived on a Thursday morning while I was getting ready for school. Mom opened it at the kitchen table and read it out loud. All 3 of them were now in different facilities serving their full sentences, separated by the prison system to prevent any coordination. The judge had issued a no-contact order protecting us from any communication attempts, meaning they couldn't write letters or have anyone contact us on their behalf. Bethany said this was the final legal update she'd be sending unless something changed dramatically. Mom printed the email and filed it away in the folder with all the other court documents, then closed the folder and put it on the top shelf of the closet. She said she hoped this was genuinely the last time we'd ever have to hear about any of them, that they could serve their time and we could live our lives without their shadow hanging over everything. The art club at the school had been meeting after classes on Wednesdays, and I'd been walking past their room for weeks before finally going inside. The teacher running it showed me their current projects and asked if I wanted to join. I signed up and discovered I actually liked photography, which felt strange and ironic given Grandma's obsession with her camera. But my photography was completely different, focused on capturing beautiful, ordinary moments instead of manufacturing evidence of crimes that never happened. My first project assignment was to photograph something that represented home, so I took a series of shots around our apartment. The kitchen table where Mom and I ate breakfast together, the locks on the door that worked from inside, the window in my room that opened all the way, the couch we'd picked out together at the thrift store. Looking through these photos made me realize how much these small details mattered, how they added up to safety and peace. We moved into the new apartment on a Saturday with help from Mom's co-workers who volunteered to assist with the heavy furniture. The place had 2 real bedrooms instead of 1 bedroom and a converted closet, plus windows that let in actual sunlight and a balcony just big enough for 2 chairs. Mom and I spent Sunday painting my room the light blue color I'd chosen, working together to cover the boring beige walls with something that felt like mine. We hung curtains we'd picked out at the discount store, simple white ones that we could actually open and close whenever we wanted. That night, we sat on the balcony eating takeout pizza and looking at our new neighborhood, watching normal families walk their dogs and kids ride bikes. Mom said this felt like claiming space that was truly ours, not borrowed or temporary, and I understood exactly what she meant. Carol called 6 months after the sentencing hearings to check in and see how we were doing. I was able to tell her honestly that we were doing well, that Mom had gotten promoted and we'd moved to a better apartment and I was making friends at the school. Carol sounded genuinely happy when she heard this, saying we were one of her success stories, and she wished all her cases ended with the victims being okay. Her comment made me stop and think about how many cases probably didn't end well, how many people got trapped in bad situations without finding a way out. I felt grateful we'd gotten lucky with Mom's lawyer recording my call and the police finding all the evidence, grateful for every person like Carol who'd helped us navigate the system. When we hung up, I realized I probably wouldn't hear from her again unless something went wrong, and that felt okay because it meant we were stable enough to not need constant checking in. Mia invited me to her birthday party 3 weeks later, a casual gathering at her house with about 10 other kids from the school. I almost said no out of habit, but forced myself to accept because I was tired of letting fear control my social life. The party was normal and fun, with pizza and movies and Mia's parents being kind and relaxed. I watched how her parents interacted with her, teasing her gently about her messy room and asking about her homework without being controlling or scary. They offered everyone snacks and made sure we were comfortable, acting like parents were supposed to act. I didn't have a single panic attack the whole evening and didn't need to leave early. Walking home that night, I felt like I'd passed some kind of test, proved to myself that I could do normal teenage things without falling apart. Mom mentioned over dinner one evening that she'd started seeing someone from work, very casually, just coffee a few times and one lunch. She looked nervous telling me this, watching my face carefully for any negative reaction. I told her I was genuinely happy for her and meant it, understanding she deserved to have a life beyond just work and taking care of me. We agreed she'd take things slow and only introduce me to him when she felt ready, when it seemed like the relationship might be serious. I appreciated her asking instead of just bringing someone home unannounced, treating me like my opinion and comfort mattered. That night, I thought about how Mom was rebuilding her whole life too, not just helping me rebuild mine, and how brave that was after everything she'd been through. Willow and I started spacing out our sessions from weekly to every other week, as I got better at managing my anxiety and panic attacks on my own. After 2 months of that schedule, we moved to once-monthly appointments, with the understanding I could call if I needed an emergency session. She told me during our last weekly session that she was proud of my progress, that I'd developed real coping skills and wasn't just surviving anymore, but actually building a life. I realized I was proud too. Proud that I'd survived something terrible and was managing to create something good anyway. I still had bad days where the nightmares came back or I couldn't stop checking the locks, but those days were getting fewer and further between. I was learning to trust that safety could last, that not every good thing would get ripped away, and that felt like the biggest victory of all. The anniversary of Mom's release arrived on a Tuesday in March. We marked it quietly, choosing our favorite neighborhood restaurant with the red vinyl booths, and the waitress who always remembered we both liked extra lemon in our water. Mom ordered the chicken parmesan she'd been craving since her first week out, and I got my usual burger with fries. The restaurant was mostly empty, just us and an older couple by the window and someone doing paperwork at the counter. Mom looked different now than she had that day outside the prison. Her face had filled out, the dark circles under her eyes had faded, and she smiled more easily. She cut into her chicken and looked up at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. She said she never imagined we'd be here, safe and stable and actually happy, living our own life without constantly looking over our shoulders. I told her I always knew we'd make it somehow, even in the guest house when everything seemed impossible. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and we finished our dinner talking about normal things like her upcoming performance review at work and whether we should finally get a cat for the apartment. Walking home that night, I realized the anniversary didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It just felt like marking time, acknowledging how far we'd come. Willow suggested during our monthly session that I write a letter to my future self describing everything that happened and how I got through it. She said to seal it and open it in 5 years, as a way to mark how far I'd come and remember what I'd survived. I spent 3 evenings at our kitchen table writing it all out, starting with the courtroom and ending with that anniversary dinner. My hand cramped from writing so much, filling page after page with details I was afraid I'd forget if I didn't record them now. I wrote about the guest house and the window I smashed and the phone I found. I wrote about the moment I realized Dad was part of it, and how that betrayal felt different and deeper than anything his parents did. I wrote about waiting outside the prison for Mom and how she held me without saying anything. I wrote about our apartment and the locks that work from the inside and the small routines we'd built together. When I finished, I had 12 pages front and back, my handwriting getting messier as I went, but every word important. I folded them carefully and put them in an envelope, sealing it with tape and writing the date I should open it across the front. Tucking it into my desk drawer under some old school papers, I felt something shift inside me. Writing it all down made me realize how much I'd grown from that terrified girl in the guest house, how I'd saved myself and Mom, how I'd built a new life from nothing. Mom came home one evening and said she'd been thinking about officially changing our last names. She wanted to completely separate from Dad's family identity, to have a name that was just ours with no connection to them or their crimes. We spent weeks choosing a new name together, trying out different options and seeing how they felt. Mom wanted something simple and common, a name that wouldn't stand out or draw attention. I wanted something that meant something, that felt like it represented who we were now instead of who we'd been forced to be. We finally picked one that felt like a fresh start, a name neither of us had any history with. The paperwork took forever, forms and fees and waiting periods, but the day it was finalized felt like another kind of freedom. We went to the courthouse together to pick up the official documents, and Mom cried when she saw her new name printed there. Walking out with our new identification papers, I felt lighter somehow, like we'd shed the last piece of their control over us. Elena called me into her office during lunch period and told me my grades had improved, so much that I was on track for honor roll. I stared at her, not believing it at first because of how I'd started the year. She showed me the printout of my current grades, all A's and B's, nothing below a C even in math, which I'd always struggled with. She said my teachers had noticed the change, how I was more focused in class and turning in all my assignments on time. I realized that having stability and safety made everything else easier, that I could actually focus on learning when I wasn't constantly afraid or having panic attacks in the bathroom. Elena smiled and said she was proud of my progress, and I felt this surge of something that might have been pride too. Walking back to class, I thought about how honor roll had seemed impossible just a few months ago, how I'd barely been able to sit through a full day of school without needing to leave. Now I was succeeding at normal things, building a normal life, and that felt like proof that we'd really escaped. Bethany sent a final notice by email on a Thursday afternoon. All appeals had been denied, and the sentences were final. Grandma and Grandpa would serve their full 4 years, Dad his full 5 years. Mom read the email at the kitchen table while I did homework, her face completely still. Then she deleted it, closed her laptop, and looked at me. She said this chapter was completely closed now and we could stop looking over our shoulders, stop waiting for news about appeals or early release. I felt something release in my chest, tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since the sentencing hearings. No more legal updates, no more court dates, no more wondering if they'd find some way to get out early. They were locked up and staying locked up, and we were free to build our life without them. Mom got up and made tea, and we sat together watching the evening news like it was any other night, except it wasn't. It was the night we finally stopped being victims and became just two people living their lives. The acceptance letter from the summer photography program arrived in a thin envelope that I almost threw away thinking it was junk mail. I opened it standing by the mailboxes in our building's lobby, reading the first line 3 times before it sank in. They'd accepted me into their intensive program, 8 weeks of classes and studio time and field trips to galleries. It was my first step toward maybe pursuing art seriously, toward having a future that looked like something I'd chosen instead of something that happened to me. I ran upstairs and showed Mom, who read it carefully, and then hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe. She took the letter and put it in a frame she bought at the corner store, hanging it in our living room next to the window. I caught her looking at it sometimes when she thought I wasn't watching, this proud smile on her face that made me feel seen and valued in a way I'd never felt before. The program didn't start until June, but having it there on the wall felt like proof that I had a future, that I was building towards something good. Mom and I created new traditions that had nothing to do with our old life. Sunday morning farmers market visits became our routine, walking through the stalls and picking out fresh vegetables and flowers for the apartment. Friday night cooking experiments turned into our favorite part of the week, trying new recipes we found online and laughing when they turned out terrible. Monthly movie theater trips gave us something to look forward to, picking whatever looked interesting and buying too much popcorn. These small rituals built a life that was ours alone, untainted by the past. Nobody in our old life would recognize these traditions, and that was exactly the point. We were creating something new from scratch, building memories that had nothing to do with cameras or locked doors or courtrooms. Each Sunday at the market, each Friday in the kitchen, each month at the theater, we were proving that we could have normal, happy moments. We were proving that what happened to us didn't define what came next. One evening on our balcony, Mom told me she was finally sleeping through the night too. We laughed about both of us being so paranoid about checking locks at first, how we'd both gotten up multiple times every night to test the doors and windows. Now we just locked up once before bed and actually slept until morning, trusting that we were safe. Mom leaned against the railing, looking out at the street below with the evening traffic and people walking dogs and kids playing on the sidewalk. She said she was genuinely happy now, happier than she'd been in years, maybe happier than she'd ever been. I realized I was too, not in spite of what happened, but because we survived it together and built something good from the wreckage. We'd taken the worst thing that could have happened and somehow made it through to the other side. We had our new names, our small apartment, our quiet routines, our fresh start. We had each other and nobody watching through windows with cameras and doors that locked from the inside. We had a future that looked like whatever we wanted to make it. Standing there on the balcony with Mom, watching the sun set over our new neighborhood, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt home.